On behalf of the IEA, we are pleased to welcome you to our 20th webinar in our series. We've been having a series of these meetings just to discuss various topical issues around the economic performance, and primarily we've also been relating it to the current COVID-19 that has changed operations of different things. So to start, I'd like to welcome you again on behalf of the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs think tank based in Nairobi, and our mission is to inform decision-making in Kenya through policy innovation, research, and dialogues. So we use the outputs that we get from our policy analysis and research to engage with policymakers and hope to have them develop policy that is evidence-based, or just to have evidence-based policy and laws being developed in the country. So, as I mentioned, this is our 20th webinar. We've been having this, and today's meeting, I don't know if we can project the agenda, but the program of today's meeting, the objective of the meeting today is basically to look at economic performance and the current economic crisis and crime. We'd like to relate and see whether there have been during certain emergencies or in the face of a pandemic, when the economy is performing a certain way, that crime rates tend to either be affected in one way or another. So the objective of the meeting here today is to help us clarify and shed light on those claims. We have two main speakers. I'm not able to beam the program, but we have two main speakers today. That is Mr. Kwame Owino and Leo Kemboi. They'll be helping us discuss the current economic crisis, which has been brought about by the COVID-19. And I think for those of you who've been attending our meetings regularly, you've been able, you participated during the discussion that we had on the impact or the likely impact of the COVID-19 on the economy. So building on that, we were able to make some projections in terms of how we see the economy likely to be performing in the coming years based on the effects of the current crisis. And now, following from that, we'd like to see, does that projection is there likely to be any impact of those projections on crime in the country? So, as I've stated, to do that, we'll have two presenters who have collected data from the past and analyzed it, looking at a certain period, which our presenters will modify. That basically helps us relate or look at the relationship between how the economy is performing vis-a-vis trends in crime rates. And then again, just to help us understand if at all it affects crime rates, what crimes are likely to increase, or which ones are, does it have the same effect on all crimes, or is it just a few specific ones? So without preempting too much of what the presentation will be, I think I'll just go right ahead and invite our first presenter. This will be Kwame Owino. Kwame is the Chief Executive Officer of the IEA, and he will take us through the first part of the presentation. And then later on, we will have the second presenter coming in, who I'll introduce later. So, Kwame, okay. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Kwame Owino. I think we have the wrong presentation in here. Leo, please change that. We have the wrong presentation. Okay, what you're supposed to talk about is Leo, please change to the right presentation. What you're supposed to talk about is the economic crisis and COVID-19. And what are the lessons from a 30-year survey of Kenyan data? Yes, so this is the correct one. So the outline is, that we'll talk about the fact that there's a big claim about what's the connection between crime and economic conditions. And then, of course, we'll show about, when we talk about an economic crisis, what do we mean by that? It's an output gap, which came from a health emergency to an economic shock, which everybody seems to think will last until the end of this year at the best. And then we'll review some theory and evidence. And after that, we'll examine economic performance and trends in crime over time for Kenya. We'll be taking a 30-year period starting from 1990 to 2019, and then make some conclusions. So I'll make the first part of the presentation, and my colleague Leo will present the data, and then we'll have some conclusions. Now, that big claim is, okay, let me first say how we got to be here. One of the things we hear quite a lot is we've had a series of webinars, and in one of those, question came about that, look, if government continues to keep people back home and people are unable to earn incomes, and both of those are true, hi, sorry, please keep your microphones muted so that we do not have feedback. Okay, so the main claim is that there's a public conversation that take the claim as self-evident, that weak economic performance will necessarily cause hardship, and that hardship will lead to a rise in criminal behavior. So if you see commentaries, whether on social media or even in the media itself, there's an expectation that because of the special economic circumstances that exist today, we should expect crime to occur. And when we see some pictures circulated in the media of two people robbing one person or the other, people make that connection to the existing economic circumstances. And that claim is made as if it is self-evident that all the crime that is taking place now is on account of the fact that the economy is soft. So that's a big claim that we'd like to examine. It's a common claim. It's not only one that Kenyans believe. But I think below it are two questions that we would provide answers for today. And the first one is, what kind of changes occur and which crimes are most evident when we have an economic shock such as what we do have? And figures, of course, that have been released for the first quarter of the year show that towards March, there's really, really poor economic conditions. Now, and then the second one is that, do changes in economic conditions affect long-term trends in criminal activity? Because one of the things that you'll see is that criminal activity, broadly speaking, does not occur on a year-by-year basis, because there's no reason for a criminal to think that it's January and therefore let me start and then next year forget. So basically, it's a long-term trend, and where those trends are, it's important for us to ask, how do they intersect or how do they interact with the fact that economic difficulties take place? So that's a big claim. Now, so let's start by asking ourselves that, yes, what are the trends in Kenya's economic growth from 1990 to 2020? So that's the 30-year basis to just get a brief view of what we see. Now, this chart here on slide 4 tells us what the economic performance of Kenya has been in terms of economic growth rates from 1990 to 2020. And this tells you, to 2019, of course, there's a focus for 2020, which is that broad, towards the end, that blue line falling sharply, because there's expectation that Kenya's economic growth will fall very sharply towards the end of this year. Now, if you look at this, what it tells you is that there's a general incline. That dotted line tells you what the growth rates would be if it was averaged over those 30 years. But you can see one important thing, which is there are very sharp fluctuations over time caused by different things. You can remember 2008, you can remember 2002, there's 1997, there's also 92 and all that. So some of them are political moments, some of them are other public moments. But on the whole, it's telling you that these fluctuations do exist. And the good thing about these fluctuations is that then they allow for us to test whether differences of fluctuations in economic performance affect crimes, which types of crimes, and whether those changes are measurable. So the only thing we need to understand here is that, yes, overall, Kenya's growth rate has been on an upward trend. based on the last 30 years, which you can see over that dotted line, but at the same time, it fluctuates around that average, which the line represents. We'll go down now to the changes in income. So one of the other effects that an economy, a poorly performing economy or an economic shock could have is it could affect overall economic growth, and the overall economic growth then affects changes in incomes. So what we see here under slide 5 are basically changes in income. So what we are seeing is that what's the change in the average income, the growth rate in income, based on how the economy performs. And you can see again, very sharp fluctuations. So those two tell you that yes, even if over 30 years, Kenyans have had an average of about 2.5–3% growth in income every year, in the overall, that too also fluctuates quite a bit. In fact, in some cases, it even went down to negative in about 1992, based on, of course, a convergence of, again, political and economic factors. Now, if you put those two together, you can tell that overall economic performance through broad macroeconomic growth, and then the other begins to affect individual incomes based on the changes that occur on a year-by-year basis. Now, so that's the background over 30 years. Let's come down to now what we call the output gap. Now, the output gap comes from the fact that at the beginning of the year, the expectation in the growth in Kenya, the expectation in economic growth in Kenya were very high. There was an expectation that the economy would grow by 6.2%. This was before anybody was aware about the emergence of COVID and what its effects would be in terms of social distancing, in terms of closing down economies, shutting down certain services, and obviously the restrictions in movement. So what we have here are what the expectations of government would have been, and the yellow line, the blue bars were the expected growth rates outside the shock of COVID. The second line, which is a reddish or orange line, is a reflection of what our estimate would be, or rather, the estimate is if a quick rebound took place. So by a quick rebound, we mean that obviously in January, there's an expectation that the economy will grow at 6.2%. This was subsequently revised. The IMF revised Kenya's growth rates initially from about 5.6%, 5.8% rather, to about half of that. And then in March, revised it to 1% growth. Now, so we are saying, if, for instance, COVID-19, which has affected Kenya now for about 3 months consecutively, continues if its effects were limited only to the first quarter of the year, so for instance, that we are able to actually get back to work much sooner than it is, then we'd expect a quick rebound, which would get us back to what we see in the blue line, in the yellow line, in the red line. And then the slow rebound is obviously there are effects that came about by virtue of the fact that the economy was affected. So one of the things that's happened is, one of the things that's clear is that it is possible that a slow rebound would take place. And if a slow rebound takes place, then the size of the economy would be what you see in the gray bar. Now, those 3 bars represent the best case, the medium-term case, the medium best case, the good case, and then obviously the bad is the third one. And you can see the differences in those bars as you go over time suggests that there's an output gap, where the output is the difference between the worst case, which is a slow rebound, and the best case, blue, between blue and gray, tells you what output is lost by virtue of the fact that there's a shock. And because of that, people have to stay at home. Certain businesses will not work. Some businesses may actually suffer. People's healthcare may be. Remember, all these come from a decision that was made, the correct decision, to keep everybody away from work, partly because you need to keep infections low in order for health services to be provided and for to ensure that the mortality rates are brought down. And obviously, over time, as you buy that time, government is able to prepare systems, health systems, for people to respond. So as you're seeing, as we go over between 2020 to 2023, you can see the gap between the blue line and the gray line getting bigger and bigger. That difference between those two gaps and the middle one is what we call the output gap. Now, that's output gap in total economic production that is lost, but it also comes back to what individual incomes would be. So there's both a macroeconomic effect in terms of this. The economy would be smaller than it should be, because we are measuring it in trillions of shillings. So the difference between 1 year, between 2020 would be almost a difference of 1.5 trillion shillings in the size of the economy. 1.5 trillion means more than 100 billion worth of production per month is lost by virtue of the fact that we had to make that adjustment had to be made. So that's how, and by the time you get back to 2023, given those same trend lines, the difference would now be much, much bigger. So obviously what that tells you is that there's an irrecoverable loss that comes with the fact that an economic shock takes place. And this happens through many others. Remember, the economic shock came from the fact that there was a health problem. The right decision was made to keep people away because this was a fast-spreading disease. It was thought initially to be very lethal. People have learned how to deal with it much, much better now. But when it first came in, it was scary, and rightly so. Precautionary principles had to set in. So this is what the output gap are. So this output gap affects two things. It affects overall economic vibrance, and secondly, it affects the incomes that people have. Those differences in output mean some farms lost sales, some closed, some people lost jobs. As you can hear in Kenya as well, some farms are trimming, making themselves smaller, and in other cases, there's been a slash in incomes for people. And some sectors have closed completely. So that's what's reflected in those differences in output gap. So that output gap, please do bear that in mind. So that's basically what you're saying. So this is how the shock manifests itself at the macro level within firms, and then obviously affects individuals through the incomes that they have, or if they run businesses, their businesses might actually not be able to operate by virtue of the fact that this shock is maintained. So let's go now to the next part. We want to explain. So what does the theory of economics say, and what does the evidence tell us? That what are the drivers of economic behavior, especially those that are related to economic performance? One of those is poor labor market conditions. So if there are people who are looking for jobs and they're unable to find jobs, and that's the argument that many Kenyans have been making, that if people have no jobs and they have no incomes, they commit crimes in order to be able to feed themselves or to meet their needs. And it's also true that sometimes poor labor market conditions, which affect unemployment, may be drivers of economic unemployment, and therefore have this. The second one is that high income inequality. Now, income inequality is known as a factor, and especially if you talk about countries with high income inequality, which is some parts of South America, even Africa. So if you talk about urban areas and specifically say Kenya, South Africa, and countries with huge inequality, Nigeria being among them, tends to have also higher levels of some kinds of crime. And these kinds of crime tend to be the crimes of violence and crimes of robbery. Some studies also say that ineffective education may create crime in the sense that if you have education that does not provide the right skills for people, what that means is that they're not able to have high productivity. If they do not have high productivity, they are unable to anchor themselves to farms and to provide enough value in a way that assures them of jobs. So it comes again through the skills effect, and the skills effect of performance of those in the sector. So some of these things are very obvious to you. The most important thing we'll be trying to do is testing them regarding Kenya's performance. But one other thing that's also known is that recessions depress overall employment and youth employment specifically, especially. So that when you have a recession, the nature of most businesses is, and by a recession I mean sustained poor performance in the economy. And we've tried to show that from poor performance, the economy gets smaller, farms have lower sales, then they're unable to pay their workers, so people either lose income or they lose income in terms of losing jobs, or they have to take much lower incomes. So basically, recessions usually depress overall employment and youth employment specifically, because younger people, in relative terms, have less experience. If you're just leaving high school, for instance, or if you're just leaving college, if a recession coincides with when you're leaving, then obviously it leaves you at a disadvantage in terms of how much work you can, how much you can be employed. And as you can see within Kenya as well, there's a video clip that was circulated showing two young boys and a motorcycle rider, I suspect, who robbed a certain gentleman. And many people say, look, they're young. It's a reflection of the fact that they do not have employment. And now, whether that's what explains this or not is a different matter altogether. But there are many things that actually affect employment that affect crime rates, especially more violent, visible crime rates, much more than unemployment. But the youth are specifically, and in Kenya, of course, we have a huge population of youth. Obviously, if people are not able to move, are not able to do some trading, then it's possible that some people have a gap in how they earn their incomes. And it is possible that they might resort to, or if they're already in criminal activity, they might actually intensify those activities. There's also the all-cause mortality falling. Now, there's this Case and Deaton say that some of the positive things about recessions and moments of economic difficulties, unlike what people expect, actually, mortality rates fall, which goes counter to the view that violent crimes and the possibility of homicides would rise with economic performance. So it's telling us that the story is actually more nuanced and more textured for the reason that many more things drive crime than just what the economic day-to-day performance would be here. So we go now to the second part, basically, what are the welfare implications? Now, specifically, we are citing here some studies, just as before we come to Kenya's data, where we have shown that it's been shown that poor economic conditions lead to property crimes. Not crimes of violence, because you can categorize crimes by various ways, but poor economic conditions lead to property crimes. There are studies that show that. But Finkler in 2011, writing a paper for the US Congress, the US Research Service, US Congress Research Service, Congressional Research Service, and the synthesis of different papers shows that there's no consensus, which suggests that there are things that beyond just economic conditions alone. But it makes sense to think that poor economic conditions will lead to property crime, because property crime are crimes of an economic nature. So definitely people would want to acquire items, for instance, that would lead to gaining some income. And you might see complaints as well of the media, and actually some have been covered in the press, where because people are staying at home, there are many more people receiving messages by people who actually try to divert your attention or get you to click, telling you that you need to change your bank details so that they can actually acquire your personal numbers and use that to make fraudulent withdrawals from your accounts, whether it's your mobile money wallet or any others. I think there's been a proliferation of them. And most of those are actually related to property crimes. There's no consensus that there's a firm one, because sometimes those associations are weak, but I think it's a sensible thing and it does get seen. What many people argue is that sometimes those poor conditions lead to property crime. The argument might be that it actually does not lead to new property crime. It just leads to a diversion in the form of crime. So the same people who would be committing crimes, who would be mugging people, say, for instance, within a park in Nairobi or a dark street, are now coming closer to estates and sort of residential areas because they know you're jogging in the evening. So really, it's not a different crime, but it's a different location for that crime, which might be in a place, if it would otherwise have taken place in a place that has no CCTV cameras, but now it's taking place in a place that has CCTV cameras, and therefore it's more salient to us, maybe so. And then the channels from unemployment to need for income or extended leisure. Now, the argument is that some people argue that, look, if you have youth, and especially men, between the ages of 17 to 40, the employment rates related to men between the ages of 17 to 40 correlate very highly with low crimes. Why? Because most crimes of property, but specifically crimes of violence, are actually committed by men and younger men, 17 to 40. Of course, men above 40 commit other forms of crimes, but it's a different one. So most of these crimes are specific to that demographic. So if men have more leisure time in their hands by virtue of an economic shock or unemployment, then obviously it is possible that they might use that time to engage in some mischief. It sounds very instrumentalized, but that's the channel that's claimed. So keeping people busy through jobs is one way of measuring, of making them provide for themselves, but in addition to that, preoccupying them so that they do not multitask. I mean, because many people can't multitask, so if they have a job, they've done an 8-hour job, it is not possible for them to. Some people are probably more gifted, but it's not possible for them. So this is that jobs are a form of diversion of youthful people. The very basic criminology theories, but I think they should be subject to assessments. And then, but I think one that we think is clear is that it's been known that the more violent crime cities, or rather the 50 largest cities of the 50, the economists put together, I think in 2017, a ranking of the most violent cities in the world. And how they did that was basically the number of homicides that take place in a city every year divided by its population, and that becomes the crime rate. And they classified cities, and they found that cities with the highest, most violent cities, or the most violent crimes, are also cities in countries which have the highest income inequalities. And that we found were countries mostly. The top 50 were actually, 30 of them were in what is called the South America continent, and other countries with high inequality. South Africa was the highest in Africa, I think somewhere in the 30s, telling you how that actually there's a sensible evidence that inequality might be, or rather is related to crime. And why? When shocks occur, such as an economic shock, then inequality becomes more salient. How does it become more salient? It becomes more evident because if everybody has to stay at home, and some people, for whatever reason, are unable, I mean, by reason of the fact that they cannot go to work, are unable to feed themselves, or they have to walk to work, or whatever it is that happens, that their hardship is evident, but they see on the other side other people who are breathing as if no circumstances have changed, then it creates the very stark differences between income groups in society. And that might lead to crime, whether it's because of envy, whether it's redistributive crime. That's what Cortez called redistributive crime, which is basically some of it is simply based on that. We saw a bit of that in South Africa a couple of years back, but we also saw it when the hard lockdown was imposed in South Africa. Its effects on people who live in low-income areas was quite evident relative to other people who were in other parts of more affluent sides. But I think the one that is important for us, and part of the reason we have this webinar today, is that there's significant evidence that crime and economic indicators diverge. My colleague Leo will demonstrate this in a while, but the idea in the mind of people, and I see sometimes the media writes about it uncritically, that an economic shock, let's expect a surge in criminal behavior. In fact, that connection is not as strong as it is. Actually, there's a divergence between economic and criminal behavior, in the sense that sometimes economic indicators go one way, criminal crime indicators go another. And then the final one is that the nature, an economic shock can change the nature of crimes that take place. So Interpol have released a report in April of this year, alerting everybody. It's called the COVID-19 cyber threat level reports. And their view is that, look, people have to watch out for the fact that because of physical distancing and being away from home, typical criminal behavior will move from the streets, from the highways, and it might just now move onto the internet and all that. So there might be an intensity of activity. And I think this seems to suggest something has happened as well. I think Kenyan regulators have not responded well, but if you see the typical complaints about people saying, look, somebody called me pretending to be from my bank and asked me to issue them my cards, my PIN numbers for one transaction from my mobile money to this and that. There's been a significant amount of those, which suggests again that criminal behavior, all those people who engage in crime, actually is situational. And it's situational in the sense that they look at the circumstances and then they plot what is the best way to approach, or what is the best way to try and gain advantage, take advantage of people, given the circumstances. If people can't be away from home, they're probably on their phones. They cannot go to their bank to make clarifications. They will rely on what we tell them. So if I speak as if I am from the bank, it is possible for me to take advantage of them. Now we've spoken about the theory. Now, the evidence that we'll provide to you in terms of data is divided into two epochs. We talk about two epochs because it's basically the data regime in the collection of crime. And Kenya has significantly good data going back 30 or more years, telling us what kind of crimes are committed each year, and in some cases, even by the geographical location, which were the old districts. So it's possible to actually get a good view about what the data is. However, the data regime will split the two epochs into starting from 1990 to 2000, so that to 1999, the 10-year period, and then from 1999 to 2019 for two reasons. One of them is the data up to 1999 was presented in a totally different way, and so we cannot mix them, because if we did, we'd be confusing one thing and the other. And the other is that from 2003, when we had a revamp of crime laws and we had the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act of 2003, of course, it's been amended many times since then, it introduced a new set of economic crimes, which provides a different picture that's worth looking at. So we'll do an analysis based on the first epoch, which is the first 10 years, 90 to 99, and then after that, 1999, 2000 to 2019, to see what the pictures are. And what we'll be doing is asking ourselves, given the fluctuations in income and given the fluctuations in economic growth, every time Kenya had a shock, some of our shocks could even be caused by drought. If many Kenyans rely on agriculture, if there's a drought, obviously people's income is affected. So those income effects, because we're trying to isolate the economic side of it, those income effects and those shocks to the economy, how do they affect the reported crimes to the police? And what does that tell us about the connection between crimes on the one side and economic changes? Thanks. So my colleague Leo will take it from here. Thank you very much, Jackie.
As he's said, we are going to have the second part of the presentation, which will be done by Leo. Leo, the floor is yours. Oh, and before Leo comes, I'd like to remind us that we have platform, a chat box on this platform where you can ask your questions. In case you have any questions as we go, please, you can begin to note them there, and our presenters will be able to review them and respond to them during the plenary session. So Leo, welcome.
So, good morning. Now, just to pick up from where Comrade has left. So, what we did was to pick some select types of crimes and also compare the total number of crimes over those two epochs, as Com has mentioned. So, the first part would be to analyze the first part of the analysis was the 1991 to 2002 period, and as you see from the chart, so what we did was to correct the total number of population, correct the total number of crimes with the population, so that we can get a comparable number over those 11 years that we're analyzing. So, and then what we did was to also see if economic growth rates could explain actually the changes in total number of crimes. So as you see from the chart is that over that period, the average economic growth rate was 1.93%. This is a low number of these are a lower economic growth rate, and it can be explained because at that time Kenya was undergoing the economy was not much opened, and the liberalization and had not yet taken fully in place. There were a number of issues like the crash in 1993. So you can see the general economic trend is that it's much lower. So generally, the total number of crimes over the same period has kept falling. And that can be explained by the trend line in the orangish color. So as you see that in those years that there was an economic shock, in the subsequent year, there was an increase in crimes. So as you can see, like in 92, there was a steeper, there was an economic shock, and in the subsequent year, 1993, the total number of crimes went up. And that can also be seen, as you see also in 97, the economic shock, and then the subsequent number of years. So looking at crime, what we can say generally in that period is that you cannot compare, you cannot actually look at crime in a single year. You have to look at it from a medium-term perspective, so that you can see those changes, because there are other changes there are other issues that explain the changes in crimes. So to look at the second chart, so we picked murder, the crime of murder, and corrected it with population to get a comparable number. So as you see from the chart, it's murder. The blue line is murder for every 100,000 people, and then the orange color shows the trend in economic growth rates. So over that period, the economic growth rates have remained stagnant. There was no much change, and that's why you still the same average of the same economic growth rate of 1.93%. The average economic growth rate within that period was 1.93%. So when you check on the blue line, you can also see that there's positive correlation between murder and economic growth rates, but we still see the issue of the lag. So in that, the same thing we saw with the total number of crimes, the subsequent in the subsequent year, if there's an economic shock in like in 1992, in the subsequent year, the number of crimes rose, and you can see with the year 2000 and the year 1997. So to pick, there are several types of crimes. There, like for the reason why we pick robberies is to explain the aspect of property crimes. So in the long term, between those periods 91 and 2002, there's been a general drop in the number of robberies, and so just like the rest of the previous charts, we corrected the total number of robberies in each year with the number of population in that year, so that we can get the general trend. So with an economic growth rate, as you can see, the trend is still the same. The growth rate in that decade remained stagnant over a period of time, with slums that are much bigger. So on the orange line, robberies per 100,000, is that, as you can see, when the year that there was an economic shock, the number of robberies also came down. But with increase in economic, like 1997, for example, a very clear example would be 1997, an increase, the economic growth slumped, but the number of robberies per 100,000 people went up. The same thing in the year 2000, when there's a dip in the economic growth rate, in the economy, a shock in the economy, also robberies by 100,000 people went up. So generally, what we can take from this chart is that over the long term, the economic growth rate has been stagnant, but at the same time, the number of crimes has gone down. So another crime that we picked to compare with that period is the break-ins. So it's not just what you can get from this chart is that, so first, to explain the methodology, is that we corrected the number of break-ins collected by data from the data we collected with the population growth, so that we can get a comparable number, and at the same time we still use the same variable of economic growth rates. as you can see, there are years that the economy, there was an economic shock, 92, 97, and the year 2000. So anytime, like, the, so this crime is unique because there are other things in the economy that explain it, that explain the increase in the number of break-ins, other than the general changes in economy and subsequently in incomes. So, like for example, in 1992, when there was a dip in the economy, the numbers for the number of break-ins by 100,000 people rose, and you can see the decline continued until 1994, and then it went up. We don't see a direct correlation between the two, but in 1997, when the economy slumped, the number of break-ins went up, and in the subsequent year, the number of break-ins per 100,000 people went down. So in 2000, when there was an economic slump, the number of break-ins went up. So that the key things for this specific crime. There are other although the correlation is there and it's stronger, but there are other things that could explain why the number of break-ins increased in a year or not. So now to come to the second epoch. So to explain the total crimes so we still maintain the same methodology. We corrected the number of crimes to 1,000 people. We corrected the total number of crimes with population, and so that we can see we could be able to see the trend. So if you see in the year 2000, so as Comrade explained, the differences in the two epochs is because of, one, the data regime, and secondly, the issue of the laws. And even when there are new laws, they classify crimes in the two epochs is entirely different. So the difference between now to comes to the difference between the previous epoch is that the average economic growth rate between those periods was 1.93%. The average economic growth rate in this period is 5.4%. So in this period, we witnessed from 2004 to 2019, we have witnessed tremendous increase in economic growth and subsequently in incomes. So, and at the same time, so we had a slump, we have had shocks here and there in 2008 because of the post-election violence, because of the election dispute in 2007. So that's a political economy issue. In 2012, and this could correspond to remember the commodity issue, the commodity problem, that the euro crisis. You can see 2017 also because of elections. And so those are some of the shocks within this period. So in 2008, when the number of so as you see, the blue line is economic growth rate, the orangish line is crimes per 100,000 people. So as during when the economic shock went down, the number of crimes per 1,000 people had been stagnating from 2004. It was up in 2004 and then went down in 2005, 2006, 2007. So it was a continuing trend. At the same time, you can see from 2013 to 2017, the number of crimes, actually, although the difference is not much, but the number of crimes have remained relatively stagnant compared to the economic shocks. So in the previous period, the economic shocks could largely explain the movement in the total number of crimes. But in this period, we find that the economic shocks, the movement in the total number of crimes are explained largely by other issues. So to move to the next, so homicides. We see, so then the blue line explains it shows the trend in the rates of the economic growth rate. The orangish line shows the murder per 100,000 people. So we maintain the same methodology. So the number of homicides within the same period, actually, there have been sharp movements within the same period, and the correlation between the two is much stronger, as 0.14. So in the year, so we can see the number of shock years. In 2008, which was a shock year, the number of crimes actually declined in 2007, but went up slightly in 2008. In 2010, when the economic growth rate went up, also the number of crimes went down and then went up again in 2011. These could be attributed to changes, like, for example, change in the constitutional dispensation. So 2013, the number of crimes went up. 2014, and then it went down in 2014, and has remained relatively stagnant from 2015 up to now. So the main message here is that, given the nature of the crime of homicides, there are other things that explain this, that could explain this, that explain the trends in the last 15 years of this data, other than, because this is up to the most current data, other than the economic shocks. But we still see the issue of the lag, that when there's an economic shock in the subsequent year, there's a slight increase. And this could be explained by, maybe because of the nature of the psychology, the other things, like, for example, suicide. So in that year of the shock, we don't see the effect, but in the subsequent year, the effects come out. So to compare again the same offense of robbery, 2004 to 2019, the blue line shows economic growth rates. The orangish line shows the robbery per 100,000 people. The general trend over these years, from 2004 to 2019, is that the number of robberies have been in decline. So what to note is that in the year of shock, for example, in 2007, 2008, and given the nature of the issue of post-election violence, but the number of robberies remained stagnant, and then it continued falling with the improvement in growth. And then 2012 it went down, and that is the same year that we had there was a dip. From 2011 it remained stagnant, and then 2013 has been going down up to 2019. So this one gives a mixed picture. So the break-ins. So we maintain the same methodology. The orangish line shows the number of break-ins per 100,000 people. So, and then also the economic growth rates, the trajectory of economy. So the shock years, 2008, which is most severe, and then 2012 and 2017. if you see in 2007, in 2008, the number of break-ins by 100,000 people went up. In 2012, the number of break-ins also by 100,000 people went up. In 2017, you can see also the number of break-ins per 100,000 people went up. So, given that this is a property crime where someone is breaking in with the intention of either whether they're looking for a physical good, whether it's money, whether whatever the thing is that they're breaking in for, but it shows clearly that there's the two move together. So in those shock years, you can see that there was an increase. So as I went up, it's clear the two in the early between 1991 and 2002, some of the economic growth rates could largely explain the trends in crime. But from 2004 to 2019, economic growth rates, other issues apart from the economic growth rate largely explain crime. Another thing that we've noted from the data is that when in the year of the shock, in the subsequent year, there is a lag. In the subsequent year, the crimes go up. So, and this has direct implications if in the kind of economic recovery we are going to have, whether it's a V-shape, a U, a W, or an L. So it gives a proper picture that in comparative terms, that this era we are in, with the constitution, with the new constitution, with the revamped laws, and with the revamped laws, and a better performing economy from the other one, is that other things now play part in the kind of crimes, whether crimes give rise up, or the types of crimes that we see. Okay, thank you. So we go to Jackie. We go back to phone.
Thanks a lot, Leo, for that data. I think we just immediately go back to the lessons and conclusions. Kwame.
Okay, fine. So what have we done? We have taken us through a 30-year survey of reported crimes in Kenya. And what we are reporting is not the number of crimes per se, but the crime rate. So what we've done is to ask ourselves, for every year, because the number of people in the country changes, we have divided the number of crimes by the population to find the crime rates. Now, that's the conventional way in which it is done, both in criminal science, criminology, and also among economists. So what you're seeing are not necessarily overall crime rates, but you're not seeing overall crime numbers, but you're actually seeing the crime rate, which tells you what is the probability as a person that you would suffer from that crime. And we've divided that number by 100,000, and in some cases by 1,000. So that's one way of understanding what the crime rate is. So let's go now to what our lessons and our conclusions are. Now, before we talk about our lessons and conclusions, guys, can I have the next slide? So here, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that the income inequality is associated with a different form of crime, especially crimes related to crimes related to property crimes and violence. And so the most violent societies in the world, or cities in the world, are also those that actually exhibit the highest forms of income inequality. So we are talking about what we call the South American nations, so Brazil, most of those. So we'll talk here about Brazil, we'll talk about, to an extent, Mexico as well, but just generally Southern American nations tend to have very high inequality, not necessarily poverty, but the difference between those who have a lot of money and those who do not. And when you have an economic shock particularly, it tends to make more salient those differences. So here we are measuring Kenya's inequality to see. One of the things we must understand that the data has shown us, irrespective of the crime economy picture is a complicated one, because it's not only economic performance that does drive crimes. But what we see here is the Gini coefficient. The Gini index is a measure That was generated by the United Nations, I think about 30, 40 years ago now, and it's used to measure income inequality. So the higher that number is, the more unequal a society is. So we couldn't find year-by-year numbers, but we found here 5, thanks to our colleagues who found this data for us. We found out that it's always conducted every 5 years or so. And so what we have here is a trend line showing you, the blue line shows you what the Gini coefficient for the country was, which is the difference between the poorest and the poorest household and the richest household. And that difference tells you what it is. So if a country had all the income by the richest household, then its Gini coefficient would be 100. If it had all the income equally distributed, then its Gini coefficient would be 1, because that means that it's perfectly distributed among the population. So you can see that in 1992, Kenya was coming from a very highly unequal society, and that our inequality has actually been reducing. If you look at the trend line, of course, there was a bump in 2005. We can't explain why, but we suspect that might have had something to do with a drought in 2002, 2003, generated very big losses for farmers, but specifically, especially for pastoralist communities, and that led to that blip. But on the whole, if you see, there's been a significant reduction. And if you look at this significant reduction again, 1 year trends in crime doesn't tell you as much as an overall trend. And you can tell in Kenya, economic growth rates have been moving up slowly, but crimes have been falling at a far, in the overall sense, which is a bit of cheating because you can't categorize serious crimes such as theft, murder, assault together with other misdemeanors, because that doesn't tell you how they're distributed in. But even then, if you take the number of all reported crimes, it's been on a downward trend. As the economy moves forward, growth rates are going forward and incomes are going forward, you see that those lines are coming towards across. Now, they do receive certain shocks related to political moments or economic moments, as we saw, and among our most vulnerable in Kenya tends to be years where there's a coincidence between politics, which is elections, and another income shock, which tends to be droughts. So you have a convergence of both income shock and political shocks. And what that does, that tends to show is that in the subsequent year, on the year of the elections and in the subsequent year, there tends to be a blip in violent crimes and because of that lag. But this tells you that overall, to the extent that we can attribute some violent crimes to income inequality in Kenya has been reducing. Now, this is still very high. Kenya is still one of the most unequal societies, and obviously in East Africa, Kenya's inequality is the highest. This is still very high, but on the whole, there's been that drop. And why is that drop been taking place? Partly because we have some level of income growth. And this emphasizes once again the place of income growth in managing crime. Now, it's not necessarily because income growth per se means people have jobs. It might also mean that a society that's growing has more resources available for the public sector to dedicate towards crime detection, deterrence, investigation, and actually creating lower crimes by deterring crime. So that's possible. It is also possible that when societies grow and people have more income, they're able to invest that income to make themselves less vulnerable to crime. It could be from the more extreme forms of fortifying yourselves, buying alarms, or making sure you can take cabs so that you're not easy prey to somebody else who might. It might change the nature of the crime that takes place, but on the whole, if you have a high income or as your income grows, it means you're less vulnerable to some kinds of physical harm that might come to you, or even other forms of economic crimes that might fall. So what I'm saying here, what we are demonstrating here is just basically that inequality, to the extent that is associated with violent and property crimes, seems to be falling, and that might be part of the explanation. So it's not just an economic shock year by year, but this trend in inequality might suggest to us that the crime reduction might grow down much, much further. Rather, might still have some space to grow if the income inequality is reduced, whichever way that happens, whether it's by government redistribution or whether it's by making sure that poorer people also have opportunity for growth. Now, let's come down to the conclusions per se. I'll finish it very quickly. In the next chart, we are showing what our conclusions are. Now, remember that the reason crime rates, and we're talking about rates. So what we're saying is that, look, if the crime rate for, say, murder is 1 for every 100,000 people. For it to move to 2 means that the number of people who are murdered have to double. And because that rarely happens, and if population is also growing, that means that over the whole, as a population grows, and if you keep everything else constant, it's unlikely, unless you have a very big shock, for crime rates to continue to grow over time. Now, some things do tend to actually raise crime rates, but there are other extraneous variables. But all we're just trying to let you know that with population growing at one rate, for crimes to grow at the same rate means it has to grow at double the population growth rate. So crime rates in Kenya have firm medium-term trends. You saw it. Whichever crime that we saw, medium-term trends, and actually it's long-term, because if over 30 years we've shown that irrespective of the economic conditions, which create fluctuations, crime rates for property in terms of theft, physical violence, and the most extreme form of physical violence that would lead to crime is basically homicide and murder, and robberies, actually fluctuate around a trend line, but on the whole, they are going down, which in itself is a good thing. Now, that might reflect many things. A more knowledgeable society, people who are more prepared to do things, more economic opportunity perhaps, maybe better policing and management. So it's a constellation of many things, of which the economy, economic performance, and income are just one significant, but not the whole. But crime rates have firm medium-term trends, and it would take a very big shock for them to do. So what we are asking ourselves is, how would COVID, based on what we've seen the trends do? And our suspicion is, which is what we'll be announcing at the end of this, we'll actually have a study to do that, because we can't tell until next year what it would. It tells us that the firm trends might continue. Now, we saw the political moments can converge and create violent crimes, and they create those blips, and we saw them in Kenya. They tend to invariably to be around elections, suggesting to you that the question of elections management or institutional response to these political moments has not been optimal. And what that suggests is that new skills need to be developed among those who manage territories, and new resources for them to be able to deal with and actually to forestall. Because the best way to actually deal with a crime is to deter and not necessarily to have to respond to it. Response is okay because the law requires that, but on the whole, if deterrence is understood, then obviously that has a much better effects, even on the economy itself, because it creates less disruption. There are income shocks and lag in property crimes. I think Leo explained that very, very well, in the sense that, and it's easy to explain. An income shock, so for instance, this year, we know that because of COVID, it has led to an economic shock, which is going to be much longer than everybody had anticipated. Growth rates are going to fall. If growth rates fall, what that means is that there are people who will have shocks. But for the first year, it is possible that you might keep a job or have lower income, but you might deplete your savings. So what that shows, that's why when a shock takes place in one way, the response in terms of the blip in crime is seen in the subsequent year or a little later. So those tell us that this year might be might be the year when the shock is delivered, but its social effects, right, will come or boomerang or become salient over next year and towards the end of this year, which tells you that the cause and effects of crime might have a seasonal character. That the cause can take place now, but it doesn't mean that today's crimes are necessarily caused. Not all are necessarily caused by circumstances today. And I think property crimes show the clearest association with economic performance. It's the strongest burn, and it's easy to see why. People have no income. Obviously, that's what property did. Some of the pictures that we've seen also show that, look, when people are unable to, social arrangements have changed in one way or the other. Criminal people actually move to people they can mark. They go and find the quote-unquote prey. And so the clearest association is up there. Murder and all those other things have a different view. And our view is actually when you keep people home, you keep people away from social places, and some of this social distancing might actually reduce overall murder rates. If we leave aside some of the very aggressive policing that's taken place and where lives have been lost. So if we determine next year at such a time, we might actually examine and find out that maybe murder rates might actually, at the personal level, might actually have come down on account of the fact that social interactions between people may have reduced. So the kind of thing that happens outside homes, which leads to the frictions that might cause violent behavior, might be less. Of course, I know that people talk about the fact that violence within the home might increase by virtue of the fact that people are at home. That's possible. And what it actually reflects is the possibility that crime comes home because of the circumstances that will change. And I think also stay at home have a displacement effect for property and digital crimes. So I mentioned digital crimes, which is basically, it will take place in different circumstances, but right now, you're more likely to find somebody claiming that they can deliver goods to your house, and you make payment, and obviously the stuff that gets delivered is a completely different one. People cannot move, the possibilities of more intense interactions can come. So as people stay at home, it displaces some other forms of crimes, and all it creates is a different form. So the same people respond in different ways, as the Interpol report shows. So as we conclude, the point we are making at the Institute of Economic Affairs that the connection between crime and economic performance or economic conditions and changes in economic conditions are real. But I think it is not very educated to simply argue that if this happens, this kind of crimes. It actually has and shows differences in other crimes. It shows, it manifests itself. Economic changes in economic conditions manifest in different ways with different crimes. So it might show in one and not the other based on the circumstances. And we must understand that people who commit crimes are themselves motivated in many cases by some economic or other incentive, and those incentives are changed when the economic circumstances change. But it does not mean that one necessarily causes the other. As we saw, there's a lag, and some of those lags might be, in some cases, actually, economic conditions reduce some criminal kinds of behavior. Why? If people are restricted from drinking, which is difficult to say in Nairobi today or in places, but it's possible, the kind of conflicts that arise from public places on account of many people who are inebriated, and the crimes that take place in terms of people driving while drunk might reduce by virtue of the fact that government has introduced new regulations which restricts people's behavior in one way or the other. But that might also show up in terms of some other form of violence or some other form of deviant behavior within households or out of it. Thank you very much. And we have references here for all this, so this will be circulated. So thanks a lot, Jackie.
Okay, thanks, Kwame, and thanks, Leo, for that presentation. I will not attempt to summarize because I think Kwame has summarized from the conclusions and way forward. And I think now we'll just go straight to the plenary session. I see some people had already begun asking questions on the chat box, some of which have been responded to. But how we'll do this, we'll request you to raise your hand before we look at the few that haven't been responded to on this board. I'll request you to raise your hand. There's an option for that, and then I'll cue the questions. So as we wait for the first hand, I see a question here by Martin Mulwa. Martin is asking, and analysis is, please mute your mic apart from the speakers, or unless you're speaking, kindly mute your mic. So Martin is asking, the analysis is potentially interesting and says that he sees that it has primarily focused on correlation as opposed to causation, and states that there is clearly correlation between crime rates and growth, though weak. But an interesting question would be, does crime affect growth? And he says that this could be a follow-up study. I don't know what your comments are on this, Kwame and Leo. And then Abdirahman asks, in the second epoch, to what extent is the sharp decline in robberies in 2000 to 2004? Can it be attributed to, in the second epoch, to what extent is the sharp decline in robberies in 2000 to 2004 somewhat attributable to somewhat responsiveness from policing institutions in the same period? I don't know whether that question is very clear. He's asking whether the sharp decline is actually attributable to responsiveness from policing institutions. I don't know whether you can attribute it to that, if that is what his question means. Austin says that COVID-19 has led to cybercrimes, but the impact it has also contributed on the telecommunication sector is positive to economic growth. Okay, So can this not make the economy diversion and growth in the sector? That's Austin's question. Is it a positive thing that the contribution that COVID has had on the telecommunication sector? I think given from the stay-at-home and most people now exploring and using digital platforms. So again, I think Leo and Kwame can note the question. There was a question by Dakon, but I think Kwame already responded to that on the divide between urban and rural areas and whether crime rates differ in those areas. We can be able to provide you with further information on that after this meeting. Yeah, so before, okay, I see George Orido. George, kindly unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you very much for this wonderful moment to listen to these findings. I think it's an area that many have not gone through, and I think policemen or policing officers, law enforcement should be making good use of this report. My question, rather my contribution is that maybe in the research, the other elements that might have contributed to reduction in crime could be the free primary education in 2002 by Kibaki administration that basically gave a lot of hope for young people and families who a lot of them would be staying at home and doing nothing. I think by going to school, it kind of defrayed that tension and hopelessness. Number two, I think mobile money, M-Pesa, has in a way, revolutionized access and transfer of money to the extent that it has made access to money easier, and also IT to young people. So then it has made it possible for people to be engaged. And related to that, maybe the economic stimulus that we've had, the youth fund, the women empowerment fund, all these funds that had not been there before, coming through, and banks making loans cheap and all that, making young people get engaged in self-employment. And last but not least, maybe the last mile connectivity project that has lit residential areas and many places, that has become a deterrent. I heard Kwame talk about deterrent. I think the fact that our urban centers are lit at night has become a deterrent to crime. I have no research on this. These are just my reflections on what was presented, and a wonderful research, I could say. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for that, for those comments. Does anyone else have a question that you'd like to voice here? Okay, before any other questions are brought here, I'll ask our presenters to respond to the ones we have so far. And I'll start with Leo. Leo, do you have any views in response to what Martin is asking on the question between causation versus correlation in terms of this study?
Yes. So as Kwame has explained, that we intend to write up this study, and part of already, even in the presentation, we have explained the convergence between other things, for example, like political events that we think affected crime in one way or another. But we intend to write up this stuff, and we will investigate and probably consider some of the things that Martin is speaking about.
Okay, thanks, Leo. Kwame, perhaps you can respond to what Abdirahman is asking, as well as what George has his comments and questions.
Okay. I think we noticed as well that as we looked at the data that yes, robberies actually reduced quite substantially between 2000 and 2004. We were thinking the way to think about this is actually to think about what are the institutional changes, because those are easier to measure. And we conducted I did a RAF just right now about robberies, and one of the things that you saw in around 2000 to 2004, as the economy was recovering, among the things that the new administration did, though it started with the last administration, to set up specific units in police units, whose work was actually to follow up with the bank robberies and stuff like that. So that might have one issue. The second might be people just took, because Nairobi started to go into barricades. People barricaded themselves. And then thirdly, if you saw, many more banks started to make their own. So policy was part of it, but the other was actually the possibility that people also took private decisions, because that also is possible. So there's the institutional kind about what government does, but the other is about the way people respond. Because if you remember the late 90s and early 2000s, the number of bank robberies that were taking place in Kenya worried everybody. And then obviously banks responded one way, government set up a specific unit to search for it. It might have had other consequences in terms of human rights violations, but on the whole, robberies were going down, in addition to other economic circumstances as well at the time. So yes, that the police were specifically kitted and given an authority to respond to this must be part of it as as well. I think there's a question from Austin about COVID-19 has created cybercrime, but has also created growth in the telecoms industry. Let's understand one thing. It's true that because people cannot go to work and people have to work from home, what they're doing is that there's been an explosion in the applications for broadband, if we can call what we have available in Kenya broadband. Because I think it's using the word broadband too liberally. But if it's led to people asking for connections at home and for offices to actually expand their bandwidth, so because most of the business is now taking place in webinars like what we have. However, just because an industry has grown because of this demand does not necessarily mean its growth. What has happened is that people have diverted money from other places. So it's a diversion. It's not necessarily new growth. New growth could probably be created if it turns out that working from home is more efficient than what it was before. So it's efficiency that creates growth, not that if we spend money, which we could have spent in the office and spent it to get new connections at the household level, that does not mean it will show up in the accounts of telecommunications firms and the service providers, but on the other side, it will also show as a reduction, whether it's in the office and all that. So it's really what an economist calls there's an opportunity cost. We've changed the money from one part of spending to the other. We've simply transferred it from one part of it. So it's a transfer from one side. It then results in growth only if it creates efficiency changes. If it makes people more efficient and creates more value to be able to pay for it, that's fine. But if it's simply a transfer from, say, people deciding, look, we are not going to pay for office rent, we are going to cut down how much we are spending in offices, and instead we are going to use that money, then what has happened is actually not an efficiency. It's actually a transfer from one side at the other. So let's be careful about claiming that COVID-19 could create a boom. It will. For certain businesses, obviously it has, such as the ones that we are talking about and the facility that we're using right now. But it's not just true that by transferring money from paying rents or transferring money from people that people use for transport or whatever, making new money and using it to buy means that it has created efficiencies. In fact, in my view, it has demonstrated to us how inefficient the telecom sector in Kenya is, that it could not respond. The quality of service is completely poor, but it's almost as if people will deal with what they have because we are held hostage. So that you can pay for your services today, they take your money, and then they only are able to connect you 3 weeks later because they say, look, we've run out of equipment and stuff like that. So we have to be careful making that attribution. I've seen a couple of whatevers from Martin. Yes, look, to create an association is much, much easier. To actually state that crime, a specific crime, has been affected in this way by the growth rate, it is possible, but obviously it requires more definite, more critical econometric analysis. It would require us to actually have to measure that data more specifically and actually perhaps go to the original data source We can do things at time and look at the time series and do that over time. It's possible. But associations are actually safer to make than actually to talk about, look, economy dipped by 1%, that 1% dip, therefore is responsible for this amount of crime taking place. Economists do that really, really, yes, but I think you make many brave assumptions as you do that. So it's possible to actually do it, to prove that you're capable of very high-level econometric analysis, but you have to be careful about how you've treated the data and what kind of associations you're claiming. So yes, it is possible and we do it, but as we do it, we also now have to be careful about how we interpret the policy implications of that. The third point is, as we mentioned, that there's definitely a lag effect between 1 year's economic shock and last year. So we think that next year, COVID, it will show in the data, but it will be far much better because government has what we call the economic stimulus, poorly designed, but the social assistance that's being given to many people, especially in urban areas and people who are not able to work, might just cushion against any resort to crime that might have occurred. So we might actually see that the trend line does not. The only thing I'd like for you all to take from this discussion today is that there's something about the long-term trend lines in Kenya where growth is going one way in incomes and crime rates, measured crime rates, are actually falling as well. So that's a secular trend that no single factor seems to be causing. So we have to be careful about attributing everything to the economy. There's an economic effect which we can show through those through those fluctuations as Leo showed, but on the whole, we are simply telling you that there's long-term trends in data, that the data demonstrates about the shocks, about the trend in crime rates, and even things such as terrorism, which obviously occur once every year, can actually create a blip for 1 year, because if you kill, say, 100 or 200 people in one event, then obviously it'll show as a crime and raise the number of people who've died in that year, but it is not possible for terrorists or for the event to occur every day or consistently over time. So they create those fluctuations, which is true and quite sad, but on the whole, there seems to be something about crime, which suggests two things. We need to think about the institutional things that will help that trend to hold, so that obviously the less crime we have, but also to think about what are the compensating things that's coming out, or what are the new ways in which crime is showing up. If people cannot mug others in the streets, what are some of the responses that they have? Is it that they've gone into jobs, which would be good, or is it that they've transferred their skills to using it for other things? So I think it tells us that yes, we need a more clear, and as somebody suggested, there are also cultural things that suggest about crime. So you can see, if you come from a country that's very liberal with the distribution of guns, it becomes an easy instrument for any discourse or any disagreement within a house to lead to local homicide. People to harm each other within a household, or even friends having an argument that would otherwise not have ended it like that, would end up like that because of lethal weapons being available. So we agree that there's a cultural effect, but there's a legal and institutional part which also plays its role in making sure that crime rates go down. But a strong economy, nevertheless, is useful, even if the association seems to be weak because of these trend lines, but that it provides greater resources at household level for people to protect themselves, and greater resources for law enforcement institutions to respond to new crime threats as they arise, or to control new ones, or to educate people. All that makes us all the better. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. I see another question by Ona. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, or her name, Ona. So he or she says that in the period 2004 to 2019, increased terrorist threats also led to enhanced security. Could this have contributed to a decline in criminal activities? Could that explain the sort of decline that we saw Leo beaming? And then there's a specific question again from Martin to Kwame. Can Kwame comment on the idea that crime acts like a tax in the entire economy, discouraging investments, both domestic and foreign? and what are the possible policy options? So that's a question for you, Kwame. Then Dr. Peter Kabuka is asking, he'd like the presenters to explain the relation between the reduction in the gap between the rich and the poor, the Gini coefficient, and the reduction of crime over time, period. Yeah, so it's that chart that Kwame beamed on the Gini effect, the data from the World Bank, so we'd like, and especially relating it to the inequality that he was talking about. So there's a need for more clarification for that, Kwame. And then there's a further question by Rahman. In view of the COVID-19 cyber threat level mentioned in the presentation, it would be good to evaluate the efficacy of the different acts that he stated there and related laws in responding to cyber crimes that are financial, economic during the pandemic and going forward. So I think that's more of a comment. There's like, it's actually a proposal for further research or further work to be carried out after this. So I think that's something that we'll also discuss in our closing remarks and way forward as one of the things we're going to be doing. Then there's a question from Wafula saying that this is a brilliant session, and is there likely to, based on this, is there likely to be a surge in homegrown terrorism? Homegrown terrorism. I think, again, our presenters will be able to respond to that. Then Anne Maina asks that she had asked earlier, what role does culture and societal norms and morals play on the level of crime? Any thoughts on this? I think Kwame has sort of touched on it in his last remarks, but maybe he can also expand on this further. So for this, I'll start with Kwame, because I think most of the presentations are addressed to you directly. And then for any further comments, we'll ask Leo to expand.
Okay, let's start with the final question from Anne. Anne, if you remember, we've accepted that economic activity is not the only one that actually drives crime. But yes, I think cultural norms are also clear, because some cultural norms actually could be predictors of peace, or actually can also be the sources of tension and the possibility that conflicts could occur. So that's a possibility. So I gave the example of, and cultural norms can actually be also encoded in law. I think of law also as culture. So for instance, if you have laws that allow people to own guns, and I am one person who's an agnostic about whether people should have guns or not, or which kind of people should have guns. But the thinking is, I actually think, okay, let me say this. This is not IE's view. My view is actually we'd have fewer rapes. I mean, we'd have fewer offenses of a sexual nature and an attack on women if we had a law that allowed women to own guns and not men. Partly because crimes of violence tend to be people who manifest physical force against others. So if they cannot fight men, they fight women, and obviously if women had guns, that would equalize that very well and actually reduce some of the domestic offenses that they take place. Of course, you could say, what happens then if women don't want to, or if women decide not to take that opportunity? That's a different and controversial matter, but let's see. So with that quip aside, if you ask me about whether we should have gun licensing, I think I would give it to all young women to do that. They protect themselves very well and make sure that men behave well without thinking that you can physically impose yourself on people. That's Kwame's view, not IE's view, but I think I need to state it. So the question about culture and norms, Anne, is this. If you look at it, the nature of crimes that take place in certain societies. So if we, and maybe we should have a crime and economics project at the IEA so that we can actually disaggregate by year and see whether there are clusters of crime in places based on the culture and things that, and I think it does. So for instance, if you think of it, for instance, that say things such as marriage, or what kind of things people can get away with, in urban or rural societies, and there's some different cultural behaviors that some rural societies have, which may predispose people to certain crimes or others. So if you think of a crime as a crime, if you have ceremonies, associations, or other occasions that require certain things to be performed, where people have to drink certain things irrespective of whether government allows them or not, that could be a crime. It registers as a crime. But for some other people, they're seeing that as meeting certain cultural requirements. I talked about the one about guns. That's also true. We also know that societies in which government redistributes money. So one of the things that you see in societies such as individualistic societies, which is a cultural thing where people let kids and have individual societies have less of evidence, less lower instances. Remember, we are discussing rates, lower rates, because rates can be compared across societies and cultures, have lower rates of physical violence in terms of in the home, or violence in terms of partner violence, or violence in terms of beating up kids, or in terms of killing one another, but they have higher instances of suicides. So if you know Northern European countries, which are very homogeneous, and there's high government distribution, and people are very individualistic as well, to some extent, so people suffer from depression, alcoholism, and a higher instance of male suicide than in other places. So yes, culture predisposes you to certain kinds of crimes. Now, I'm not saying that a person who's mentally unwell, who's committed, who's taken his life tragically for any reason or the other, is committing a crime, but I am talking about the legal definition of suicide is a crime. Even if many doctors advise that we should not consider it a crime, we should instead consider it as a medical condition that needed to be handled. So that's what I'm saying. So yes, culture and certain things predispose people to Andrew Kimathi, please switch off your camera. So culture predisposes some people, or cultures and norms get reflected in laws, which then themselves also have an effect on what kind of crimes would take place, including in Kenyan societies where people negotiate certain things because they say if your uncle has done something and injured, say you, or injured one of your neighbors, then you can actually come and negotiate that outside the formal sector. So yes, the formal law. So I think yes. And then obviously what kind of things are owned and what kind of things people can use within the home also have cultural inclination, have an effect. So I think those norms and societies and morals play and whatever. But my view about it is that outside that, there's also the institutional side. If you have a crime, or rather, we have a law enforcement mechanism that allows people to respond to crimes based on evidence and data, as opposed to what they think, or as opposed to, look, the police have always done this, so this is what they should do. I think, in my view, every year we should hold the Kenyan police accountable for crime rates and ask them to what extent they are responsible for some of those blips, what extent they are responsible for some of those trends. So if you look at the trends in Kenya that have been rising, those trends don't seem to respond to the number of police that we have in the country. Because the number of police that we have in the country has actually risen quite as well. And now if somebody's going to claim it's because of that, we have a 30-year trend line. So obviously 30 years ago, we had hardly 20,000 policemen. Today, we almost have 100,000. We had hardly 30,000 policemen 30 years ago. Today, we have almost 100,000. And if the number has gone back, so we should ask ourselves, okay, that's fine. It's good for us to feel secure because the population is also large. But it seems that not all crimes respond necessarily to the number of police we have. So I guess I hope that does that. Wafula, thanks for I don't think that homegrown terrorism is coming. I don't think it's caused by differences of this kind, because the homegrown terrorism thing is actually also, many places define it as, or rather, it came into the literature from an American paper, which describes two things happen about homegrown terrorism and why it happens in some places and not others. One of those is that it tends to happen in societies where males are actually very isolated. So the kind of people who do homegrown terrorism tend to be very right-wing, or individual males who are very disenchanted. It might actually sometimes have something to do with the economic opportunities have gone down. and therefore all that. But in many places, it's disaffection and differences in society, very big differences. People who think that they're under cultural threat by virtue of new people coming to their societies and all that tend to be. But I think some countries tend to be more open about discussing these things than others. So maybe we should actually ask the Inspector General of Police about what his views are about whether we face a threat of homegrown terrorism, irrespective of this. I don't think we do. But I mean, what do I know? We deal with the historical data. We are not able to tell from the intelligence what the public sector knows. Martin, you're right. Martin's question was whether crime acts as a tax. Yes, we think of a tax as an imposition that raises the cost of a good or service. Often people think about it in terms of government, but it is. If you think about the fact that government of Kenya is responsible for providing security and some of those things that they say, and government uses security as a pretext for many other things that they do. Because of security, this will not happen. We have to protect people. We have to protect lives. We have to protect children, and we have to protect property. We will not allow this or that to happen. So obviously, they have a monopoly on using violence and controlling it within the republic, which is one good thing. But if they fail, for instance, say, for instance, in some parts of this country, I speak cursorily because I looked at this data a while back, but if you look at the number of cattle thefts that take place, and obviously they take place in certain parts of the country, and 500, I mean, like some reports tell you that in one place, 200 cattle were stolen from one community based on the use of firearms by somebody else, and they took the cattle and went away with that cattle from another place. It's like a tax because it's making people poorer in the sense that if 200 cattle were stolen, for instance, and each one of them costs, say, 20,000 shillings, that means that 4 million shillings worth of somebody's property or a property for a village was stolen. So ask yourself, and this happens like once every month or every two weeks, ask yourself, if the banks in Nairobi were losing a similar amount every day, I think somebody would say to the Minister of Interior, I want you to fix this. So to the extent that this is not seen necessarily as an equal, as something else that causes economic instability or causes economic whatever, it's a tax. It is also a tax because if you are paid your taxes to government to keep you safe, but your neighborhood has to install all these number of gates, all these number of alarms, and all these cameras to make sure that somebody isn't coming to burglarize your house, or somebody isn't going to come to do that kind of stuff. Or in the city in Nairobi, you have to park your car. The county government charges you for parking space, but you still have to pay somebody else to ensure that your car is not broken and entered into. Obviously, that's a tax. Now, it's a private tax, but it goes to somebody else who earns an income and deprives you of your property, which should have been the responsibility of government. So government failures actually impose economic costs on society, both from the farm level to individual level to household level. And to that extent, it is equivalent to taxation. Yeah.
Okay. There was a question that I'm not sure you've responded to on the increase in terrorism over a certain period and the enhanced policing during that period, and whether it could have contributed to a reduction in the crime rates that we've seen. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that.
Yes, I can respond to that. When Leo and I were doing this data, we did not take into account the specific terrorism, but maybe the terrorism effect needs to be analyzed on its own. But if you look at it in 2001 to 2004, which was a period under discussion, Kenya had suffered a terrorist attack in Mombasa, I think, which took place in 2001, or was it 2002, just before the elections, based on that attack on that hotel. Now, the nature of these terrorist attacks, and maybe it should be analyzed separately, but it's also crime, is tend to be episodic, in the sense that it's not a consistent thing, and so it causes one certain blip. That's true. Now, I think that the nature of terrorist attacks, again, tends to have a political interest, because basically, whoever it is, whether these terrorist groups that we know of and those that we might know, they try to arm twist governments, and it's also been shown that they tend to do governments that are democracies, or where at least the population has pressure, and their interest is actually to scare the population, to pressure governments to do certain things, whether it's to leave Somalia, or whether it's to not associate with a certain country and to associate with a different one, or whether it's to create fear that if certain countries that are supposed to be our friends have embassies in Kenya, then Kenyans will suffer, so that that association is broken. And now the interest is political, and it's very different. I am not too sure that on account of this shock alone, it will go back. That's one. Two, from what has been published on Al-Shabaab, because you asked specifically about some of these things, from what has been published about Al-Shabaab, it is not clear to me that the Kenyans who go to Al-Shabaab are going there primarily because of an economic interest. It's not clear. Because those groups, yes, they tend to do some smuggling, they do some extortion and everything else. I'm not too sure whether Kenyan might be deciding, that argument has been done, but it doesn't seem to be, that a Kenyan might be deciding that because I don't have a job, let me go and join somebody else, try to fight Kenya in this place and all that. My view is that those impulses that lead people to join terrorist groups, I'm talking about the classical terrorist groups, tend to be political and not necessarily economic, in the sense. I mean, if you want an economic thing, you're not going to wear a vest and blow yourself up in a mall or in a public service vehicle or something like that. A person who's thinking about economic gains tends to be looking long term. You want to earn money so you can live longer and actually enjoy it with your family. So I think that the motives are completely different. One is political, and so yes, we should ask ourselves whether in these circumstances where the economy is depressed, they might see an opportunity to further add to people's pains or not. I hope not, but I'm sure that's a question of surveillance and intelligence, which I wouldn't know. But looking at the data on its own, it does not seem that, unless it's superimposed, it doesn't seem that economic circumstances on their own tend to generate those. Let me refer you to a guy called Alan Kruger. Alan Kruger was a professor of economics who studied actually the connection between economy and economic incentives and suicide and terrorism. He died last year. Unfortunately, he was a professor at Princeton, and he wrote a book. Please find the paper, Alan Kruger. Just search Alan Kruger on terrorism. You'll find it. He died last year he suffered depression and committed suicide. But he studied this, and his finding was that it's not economic factors that actually do that. So that's one. There's a professor from University of Chicago called Richard Pape, who wrote a book called The Logic of Suicide Terrorism, a book that I have, and maybe one day we should make a book club for the IEA to discuss with our members. And he says the logic of suicide terrorism actually tends to be political. It tends to be specific. It's not singular one religion, even if people tend to think about it that, but it tends to be political, where countries think that they've been occupied by another country, especially if that country has some kind of democracy, then terrorism is a way of putting pressure on the population to convince politicians or to pressure politicians to do away with a military occupation or any kind of occupation. So if I take those, Richard Pape on one side and Alan Kruger, and look at what they're writing about, it suggests to me that unless our situations are very peculiar, the surveillance must be kept, but that's not what I would be worried about now. But surveillance must, of course, continue to happen. Unless these people suddenly think that Kenya is more vulnerable at this moment, then what does that mean for if we tried to harm people? I hope that is. Oh yes, there's something about the Gini coefficients. Yes, Jackie, if I may go about it again. So we had this presentation in the chat. I think it was page, it was chat number, let me just look. It was chat number 11. no, sorry, it was slide number, one of the later ones. It was slide number, anyway, one of the slides, we'll distribute the slides so that everybody has it. And what I was showing is that Kenya's Gini coefficient has been declining over the last 30 years. And we are claiming, the reason we mentioned Gini coefficient is because the literature tells us two things. The economics literature tells us four things. That the movers of crime in a society are one thing, economic inequality, that's one. The second one is, please take me to the chart, the page on, the page on Gini coefficient. So the first movers of things is, one, economic inequality is associated with certain forms of violent crime. That's the first. The second one is that the second point is that unemployment rates or income shocks can actually cause that because people have an incentive to go and use that. And also that inequality becomes more salient during shocks, economic shocks. And economic shocks, the paper that we provided was an economic shock that took place in Brazil, and places that had a shock in the sense that global trade opened, and places that used to manufacture textiles, regions that used to manufacture textiles lost when the governments liberalized, and then crime rates went up in those places relative to other parts of Brazil, suggesting that income shocks can also create crimes. And the kind of crimes tended to be property crimes, which allow people to actually convert people's property, take people's property, and use that to earn some income. So they start to trade in illegal things and all that. Now, this was a picture. So this inequality must have something to do with that fall in robberies as well. Obviously, police capability as well, because we said that we must look at it from two aspects: the institutional side about how government responds and the policy, and on the other side, so which is enforcement, and on the other side, because individuals suffer crime, governments don't suffer crime. The person who suffers crime is either a company, an individual, or a family, or a person. There's no such thing as a crime that we suffered. So basically, we, as individuals, sometimes also because of the tax that we see, we take precautions on our own. You decide to buy a car, you use your car, you arm it with alarms, you do all manner of things to raise the cost for the criminal to make sure that you do not fall victim. Now, in that same time as well, Abdi Rahman has asked, remember that incomes have been growing, as Leo showed in one of those other chapters. So inequality is falling and incomes are growing as well, not as fast as we'd like to, but incomes are falling. I mean, incomes have grown even with the shocks, but we see a definite trend, with the exception of 2005, of Gini coefficient coming down. That in itself is a good thing. The average Gini coefficient I think in most of East Africa is about 35. Kenya's is the most elevated at about 40. So it's telling us that there's still something to do. And we'd say, even if it did not bring down crime, and I'm convinced that the best evidence actually shows for violent crime, Gini coefficient is one way, we need to bring down that inequality. So it's a useful thing to actually think about how to bring down that inequality, given what it means for society generally. So yes, that's basically come. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kwame. Before I ask for the closing remarks from our speakers, does anyone else have a question? Any final one? There is none in the chat box. I'm giving a few seconds for anyone with any final question. Okay. Since I cannot see any hand and it's 2 minutes to 1 and we had promised to close at 1, I'll request our Leo and Kwame to give us their just final closing remarks in about a minute, and then we'll close the meeting. So Leo, do you have any final closing remarks? Leo?
So in conclusion is that it's a mixed picture, as like Kwame had said, and there's need for more to investigate more so that we can be able to know how crimes affect, how economic shocks affect crime. So that's my final my final comment.
Okay, thanks, Leo, and thanks for the good job on that presentation. Closing remarks.
Well, it's just yes, thanks. So what we'll do about this is we'll look for more data. We'll make it more, provide more detail, and then we'll publish this maybe in a month, and we'll keep tracking this because we know that we'll try and see whether the shock for COVID-19, which is one of the greatest shocks that any society has suffered, will have any effect on crimes and everything else. So that's one. The second point is this presentation will be available to distribute to all of you. So thanks for attending. But what we have to know, which is some happy lessons, is that there seems to be a trend, a strong trend in our view, of economic growth going up, not as fast as we'd like, but definitely. You must know that there's been a strong trend of crime in total number of crimes, the crime rate going up, and you must distinguish between the total number of crimes and the crime rate. The total number of crimes simply tells you how many were logged in with the police, which might be higher by virtue of the fact that we have a higher population, but you have to correct that for population, which is something that you must take away as a lesson from today. So the crime rate is the most important thing, not necessarily the total amount, because the total amount doesn't tell you much unless you create it. I mean, you correct it for that. Those trends, let's keep an eye on those trends. And my view is that there's the institutional side asking government to do better, and all these other side also releasing insights which inform the public debate and inform the formation of policy. Thanks a lot, Jackie.
All right, thanks a lot to Kwame and to Leo for the presentations today. And thanks everyone for attending and being here, giving us 2 hours of your time to listen to the presentation. So as has been stated, we will the presentation will be available on our website shortly. And as we have discussed, we are going to explore further areas for research, and based on the discussions we've had today, just to build on this and be able to get more data. So thanks. IA is a membership institution. So for those of you who'd like to join and be members, kindly reach out to our communications officer, Mr. Oscar Ochieng. He'll be able to assist you on how to go about it. And I think online on our website, you can also be able to get directions on how to apply to be a member. So that concludes our meeting today. We continue to engage on our social media platforms. And again, thank you for attending and have a good afternoon. Bye, everyone.